vendetta between his party, led by his family and the Nevilles, and the King and Queen's court faction led by the Beauforts and Percys. But York's initial sights were set on the heirship to the king, in place of his infant son, who was soon being claimed to be a bastard by the Yorkists, rather than a direct claim on the throne. The latter was only made after York and his allies had been driven into exile and stripped of their lands by the Queen's faction in 1459, fought their way back to power in 1460, and seized the king. Even then, most of his own supporters were opposed to his claim to be rightful king, which had to be halted, and Henry's deposition only followed the next round of the vendetta, when the Queen's men attacked and killed York and other nobles at Wakefield in December 1460, but York's son Edward IV successfully fought back. Edward IV's disputed election was then followed by victory on the battlefield of Towton, the elimination of more of Henry's allies, and eventually the capture of Henry and the flight of Queen Margaret to France. Seemingly routed for good, Henry's faction then had an unexpected stroke of luck, as Edward quarrelled with his cousin and chief backer Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who killed his chief rivals and arrested the king in 1469, backed down from deposing him, but was driven out of England by Edward in 1470, and in retaliation invaded to restore Henry VI. The unlikely alliance of Warwick with Queen Margaret, the woman responsible for the deaths of his father and brother, was then overthrown by the returning Edward in March to May 1471. But Edward died aged 40 in 1483, and his son Edward V was then deposed as a bastard by his brother Richard III. Richard, the most controversial monarch in English history, then faced the implacable hostility of many of his late brother's loyalists, who lined up with a seemingly insignificant Beaufort scion, Henry Tudor, and other die-hard Lancastrians to overthrow him in August 1485. The crown thus changed hands unexpectedly 6 times in 1461 to 85, and nearly did so again in a Yorkist invasion in 1487. Kings were deposed, murdered or not, died in suspicious circumstances, or were killed in battle. The senior nobility were destroyed by deaths in battle and political executions, and high politics seemed dominated by unsavoury and violent blood feuds. Not surprisingly, this era has provided a rich field for writers since the days of Shakespeare, and is still a favourite for romantic historical fiction, usually centred on Richard III in modern times. Recent contributors have included Rosemary Hawley-Jarman, Josephine Tay, Sharon Penman and Philippa Gregory, and TV programmes include A Trial of Richard III on Channel 4. Was he really a child-murdering psychopath, a self-preserving political strategist who went too far, or an honourable and misjudged figure smeared by Tudor spin doctors? The influence of fiction on the popular conception of the period indeed includes the very concept of a War of the Roses, not a contemporary term, but thought up by Sir Walter Scott in his novel Anne of Geierstein in 1829. The first serious historical novel about the period, Last of the Barons, by Edward Bulwer Lytton in 1843, introduced the concept of Warwick the Kingmaker, and of Edward IV as a smooth-talking lecher, whose secret betrothal, marriage, circa 1462, is still a topic of controversy. In reality, the idea of a white rose, York, and a red rose, Lancaster, faction, which Shakespeare peddled in the 1590s, comes from the retrospective viewpoint of post-1485 chroniclers, who celebrated the marriage of Henry Tudor and Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth, as uniting the 2 heraldic roses of their families. As the Plantagenet surname was a propaganda invention of 1450s Yorkists who revived the personal sobriquet of Henry II's father Geoffrey, so the notion of a self-proclaimed Tudor dynasty is inaccurate. Henry VII usually called himself Richmond after his earldom. But what is not at issue is that a remarkable degree of political instability, some of it self-generating, and changes of fortune saw control of power shift with the results of political alliances, chancy battles, kingly mental breakdown, and sudden royal deaths, natural or not. The issue arises, how easily could things have turned out differently? What if York had been